Prynhawn da, a chroeso pawb. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining this talk on the role of behaviour change in the transition to a public sector a net zero public sector by 2030. So my name is Poppy Potter. I'm head of the Welsh Government Energy Service, and that's a programme that's working with the public sector and community groups to make energy projects happen. So we work across regional energy planning, energy efficiency, low carbon heat, renewable energy, and zero emission vehicle projects. Do we have the slides, please? So this commission was a little bit different to our core work at the Energy Service. So we're going to be presenting a summary of our research and recommendations on enabling behaviour change across the public sector, with a particular focus on workforce commuting behaviours. There were lots of different people involved in this project. My colleagues Charlotte Sinden and Ava Casadevall will also be presenting with me today. So we're going to be covering the background research, our method and findings, the resulting recommendations, and we'll wrap up with a couple of case studies showing where this has been working in practice elsewhere. And we'll also finish with giving you some information about how you can find out more about this particular project. So we were asked to look at the role of public sector employees in helping reach this ambition of a net zero public sector by 2030 and how that transition could align with the principles of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, like collaboration, integration and involvement. So the primary focus of this commission was looking at local government, so all of the councils in Wales plus the National Health Service. And as we work to define the scope of this project, we realised it'd be really important to have some different perspectives from different types of public bodies. So we included representatives from a fire and rescue service and one of the national parks. So we followed Welsh Government's own approach to planning a behaviour change campaign. So starting with really looking at the research and insights and data into behaviour change interventions. Then having lots of conversations and doing a lot of listening. So in this study, nearly 350 employees from across the public sector in Wales were involved in contributing to the study and the research. Then it's a case of using those insights to inform the mechanisms for enabling those changes that we are looking to achieve. I'll hand over to my colleague Charlotte to talk about the background research.
Thanks, Poppy. So on this slide, I'm going to talk about the highlights of our background research. So an analysis of current literature on this debate found that the recipe for successful behaviour change interventions typically tends to include one of three key ingredients. The first ingredient is simplicity, as often removing barriers towards the desired behaviour is a great way to encourage change, as people tend to follow the path of least resistance. For example, setting a default option can encourage engagement, and Welsh Government have previously used this type of intervention in other policy areas, such as adopting a presumed consent system for organ donor registration. Also, changing the physical environment also helps to make low carbon choices more accessible and available. And Cardiff Council is championing this technique through improving their cycle networks and investing in extra infrastructure, with the ultimate aim of doubling the number of cycle trips by 2026. The second key ingredient is to use the power of influence, and that means using others and social norming, as people tend to be really influenced by the way that people behave around them. This could be action by enabling climate change champions to make it the norm to care for and want to tackle climate change. Welsh Government is already using this technique as well through their national recycling campaign, Be Mighty Recycle, which has been really successful, as the pressure of knowing everyone around you is recycling really makes people reflect on their behaviour in line with their community pride. And finally, the third ingredient we see quite often in successful interventions is to recognise how policies interconnect with each other by looking at the wider benefits. So instead of focusing the intervention on a single benefit, might look to establish the co-benefits. For example, if we're talking about reducing emissions from commuting by reducing petrol or diesel car usage, instead of just focusing the communications on the climate change angle, broadening it by also talking about health outcomes and reduced costs on fuel if people use active travel can be really, really beneficial. And another learning, sorry, if you could go back one. Another learning from this theme was also to design targeted interventions. So rather than just going in with a toolbox of solutions, really understanding what the barriers are to low carbon behaviours for a specific audience. And this point really drove our primary research to try and understand the needs of each organisation. Moving on to the stakeholder engagement, we did 25 one-to-one interviews across the public sector. And the main takeaways are there are already many good examples of behaviour change interventions across Wales that have either been done or were on the way. And there is a very strong willingness to share knowledge, and this point really came across in all of the interviews. So there's definitely interest and a willingness to test and learn. However, we found there's often resource constraints that can slow progress. And all of the interviewees highlighted that dedicated resource in terms of time, but also money, are needed to enable this behaviour change. And finally, the interviews highlighted the importance of measuring progress, as often it is quite hard to know what intervention or what aspect of the intervention actually made the change. So testing for progress consistently helps to check that the trajectory is heading in the right direction. Moving on to the carbon footprint analysis, at the beginning of this study, quite a decent amount of time was spent trying to understand the organisations that we are looking at. And we proposed that behaviour change interventions should target and prioritise the organisations and the departments within these that had the greatest carbon emissions. So when reviewing a sample, we reviewed a sample of public sector carbon footprints, and it's probably worth noting that this was before the official public sector carbon footprint data was available. But the analysis of the carbon footprint showed that on average, procurement of goods and services is consistently the greatest proportion of the carbon footprint in public sector bodies. However, the review also showed that the proportion of emissions from procurement that varies quite a bit between each organisation. So, for example, for fire and rescue services, procured goods and services represented 51% of their carbon footprint, whereas that jumps to 88% for national parks. And we believe this indicated that in order to be impactful in terms of emission reductions, different interventions are likely to be needed for different organisations. And it's also likely that different interventions are also needed within these organisations for different teams and departments. So to make the biggest impact, a strategic approach would theoretically be to target behaviour change interventions on the biggest emission sources. But to caveat all of this, and following discussions with Welsh Government, commuting was chosen as the focus area of this study. The reasons for this was that there's a lot going on already, particularly on procurement, and we wanted to avoid duplication. The timing of this study was also quite interesting, and we believe that this report could help to inform decisions around returning to the office post-pandemic. But also, it's important to notice that despite the fact that commuting is a relatively small proportion of the average carbon footprint, it is also linked to a lot of wider benefits that aren't captured in the footprint, particularly surrounding health and other components of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And then last but not least, it's a relevant topic for all public bodies. So it allowed us to assess whether there were any common challenges across all public sector bodies. And once we had focused on commuting, our method was to have individual interviews, an online survey, and 10 different workshops in total. Almost 350 public sector representatives from across Wales participated in this study. And I'm now going to pass over to Eva, who will talk through the research results.
Thank you, Charlotte. The results of the survey, one of the big highlights is that the vast majority of public sector employees commute by private car, often petrol or diesel cars. And when we asked them in the survey if they would like to change the way they commute, it's very important to notice that almost 70% of them said no, that they are happy with their current commute. However, in a follow-up question, they indicated that half of them indicated that they also don't see another viable option. So it's hard to know if they truly are happy or they just simply think that the other options are not feasible. But it does indicate a strong resistance to moving towards public transport or active travel. As Charlotte said, we did 10 workshops, and one of the main questions we tried to understand was, why do people commute the way they do? What are the reasons behind them? And there were 4 critical themes that came across all workshops. And a lot of them, I believe, will not come to a surprise to most of you. The main reason why people decide to commute by car is basically because it's the fastest way. It saves them time. It also helps balance the demands from work at home better. The school run, for example, arriving on time to pick up their kids was a consistent reason for people to decide to use their private car, but also the having to arrive at a particular time at the workplace was another important reason. There were many barriers to alternatives. Notoriously, the lack of public transport and cycling lanes was repeated all over the workshops, but also the prohibitive cost of EVs and the fact that the typography and the weather in Wales is not very conducive to active travel. On a more happy note, some people also said that they simply love their commute because the scenery is beautiful and it's some me time that they can have for themselves. Other examples of issues that arise and came quite consistently across the workshops was that the rising cost of fuel is really prevalent on the mind of public sector employees, and the fact that flexible working policies are not consistent across organization and then are often dependent on managers' discretion creates a lot of unrest and a feeling of not being fair, because with the rising cost of petrol, there's economic impact from going to work into the office or workplace versus doing it from home. Another topic that we think was very interesting was that people said they would love to use active travel if they actually were able to afford to live near the workplace. However, because of the price of housing, they need to live far away, and then it's just not feasible for them. In terms of wider benefits, I think most people can understand that, can assume what the wider benefits are. For example, working from home or having a shorter commute has the benefit of having more time for themselves, for their families, or even to work more. However, some nuggets of surprises came on the workshops. Like, for example, some people stated that using public transport is a good opportunity to just relax on the train, or to even to socialize, to say hi to the bus driver, which we thought was quite a different way of looking at public transport and a way to fight isolation. In terms of the recommendations, the big takeouts of this report, I'm going to split those into 2. One of the set of recommendations are for enabling behavior change across the public sector in general, and the other recommendations are actions that could help change commuting practices among public sector employees. And it's worth noticing that these recommendations come from the employees themselves, from the participants of the workshops. All the recommendations referred back to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 5 Ways of Working. We strongly recommend collaboration, bringing people to the table to hear their views, their barriers, their motivators, look at integration, how do the different pieces of the puzzle fit together, involvement, think long-term, and even prevention. Certain practices may not need to find a lower carbon practice. Maybe you actually can get rid of that practice all along. So if I dive into the recommendations on how to enable behavior change in general, the first recommendation, and something that we believe is very important, is to acknowledge the influence that organizational practices have on individual behaviors. What we mean by this is that often successful behavior change interventions don't rely on the individuals to make the right choice every single time, but they basically make the right choice the easiest, the fastest, the most convenient. So our recommendation is to map out the policies and practices that affect the behavior you're trying to target, rank which of these policies and practices affect them most, start with the most impactful one, find who has influence over these practices, and create a staged approach to tackle these practices. So going one step at a time so that you can start getting that feedback loop and learning. The second recommendation, which is also really important, is to set up governance arrangements for addressing behavior change in the public sector. As Charlotte said, there's very strong willingness to share knowledge, to learn from each other, to have best practices, and having this centralized hub would really help with that. But we also believe that governance requires some time and budget designated to behavior change interventions. Since the submission of this report, Welsh Government has already created the Cross-Government Climate Behavior Change and Engagement Group, which hopefully will support this knowledge sharing transfer, which is a really important aspect, but we would encourage each public or body to create their own governance structures as well. Third aspect, adopt a collaborative approach. This project really tried to listen, bring all the voices to the table, and we would encourage that every single policy follows a similar approach, from involving the employees themselves, climate champions, unions, etc., so that you get everyone's views and are able to create a more impactful intervention. The fourth recommendation is take a system view. See that how the pieces of the puzzle fit together. Through our research, we realized that, for example, policy trying to tackle fuel poverty will have a significant impact on the NHS Wales carbon footprint, because every time you prevent someone arriving to acute care because you've created a better environment for them, you're lowering the carbon footprint. So trying to have this system view and not only looking at behavioral change from the lenses of carbon is really important. Recommendation number 5 is apply the principles of the energy hierarchy. This is what I was saying about, for example, participants of the workshops would recommend having a local hub so that they can go print and that will reduce their mileage to go to print. But our recommendation would be first assess if you actually need to print, because during the pandemic, for example, NHS Wales fast-tracked online signature, completely preventing people having to work to the workplace to print. Sixth recommendation, very close to my heart as a marketeer, tailor the approach to the organization and the audience. You need to understand the reasons behind the behavior and the barriers people face to change that behavior before you can influence them. Understanding their values and their motivators will help you craft the message and craft the environment that will enable behavior change. 7 recommendation, decide upfront on how to measure impact and progress. Charlotte says it's notoriously difficult to measure behavior change interventions, so be consistent. We recommend having across the board surveys so you can track progress, and very importantly, establish feedback loops. And finally, but last but not least, because this is really important, focus on removing physical and structural barriers before trying to address any psychological barriers. What we mean by this is basically make sure the low carbon behavior is the easiest, the fastest, the most convenient, or at least equally with the behavior you're trying to change before you invest on any communications campaign. I'm going to move now to the recommendations on enabling change when it comes to commuting for public sector employees. As I said, these recommendations come from the employees who participated in the workshop. We had a very long list, so I'm not going to cover all of them, but we have a sample here. It's worth saying as well that the majority of recommendations focused on working from home or electrical vehicles, because there was a strong, maybe not strong, there was some resistance to using public transport or active travel. During our workshops, we asked participants for each intervention they suggested to place it in a sphere of power, basically asking them, who do you think needs to act in order for you to be able to change your behavior? So, for example, if one of the barriers is the lack of public transport, that's not down to the individuals to change. That's on others, probably Welsh Government, to change the environment before they are able to act. And strikingly, none of the participants placed a single intervention down to them. They believed that they didn't have any other option than the current commute they had, or any other option that was that they could action without someone else changing the environment. So this goes back to the first recommendation of make sure you acknowledge that societal and organizational practice before you ask individuals for change. In terms of the recommendation, the one that came across all workshops was establishing HR policies on flexible working that are consistent and fairly implemented. Another recommendation that was raised a couple of times during the workshops was to explore opportunities for staff to work in alternative locations. As you can see in the quote below, one participant stated that in his commute, he would pass 2 other council offices on the way to work, rather than being able to work in the one nearest to his home. So we would recommend assessing this state strategy and seeing if there could be some more flexibility about where people actually need to go to work. And another recommendation that I thought was very interesting was to coordinate public transport with large employers and schools, because as I mentioned before, the school pickup is a massive decision factor when it comes to people deciding to commute by car to the workplace. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Poppy to take you through 2 case studies.
Thanks, Ava. So yes, we've got 2 case studies here, both showing what can work and what has worked elsewhere. So the first case study is from over the border in Cambridgeshire for Addenbrooke Hospital. So in the 90s, nearly 3/4 of hospital staff were driving in their own cars to work. But by 2017, the number of people just driving in single occupancy cars had reduced drastically down to nearly 1/4 of staff. And instead, the number of cyclists had doubled. The number of bus passengers had increased almost 5-fold. And then the number of people sharing cars had gone from 0% to 9%, and also a small increase in the number of people walking to work. So how did they do this? You can see here on the slide, they initiated a whole range of measures to try and make it as easy as possible for people to choose the low carbon option. So they increased bus services, including free shuttle buses. They massively increased the provision for cyclists. So they installed over 3,000 cycle parking spaces. They set up a cycle repair service on site and enabled bicycle sharing schemes across the site as well. They put in electric vehicle charging points and really made sure that all of that enabling infrastructure was in place up front. On top of that, they offered a whole range of staff incentives, including interest-free loans for bikes and scooters, pool cars, and discounted weekly bus tickets, amongst other things. And then following on from that, what they found was really important was putting out a really effective communications campaign. So again, making it as easy as possible to choose the lowest carbon alternative or an alternative to that single-use car. So that included just having information readily available on all of the different options and real-time information, importantly, on bus routes, etc. So arguably it's easier to do this in Cambridgeshire, where it's a lot flatter and probably a lot drier than most of Wales. But I think what I took away from this is that it really shows that despite doing lots of different things and putting in all of that good enabling infrastructure in place, it still takes a really long time. It took them 24 years to make that drastic change and huge shift in behaviour. And this story was similar to the one we heard when we were doing the background research into Wales's recycling campaign, the Be Mighty campaign that Charlotte mentioned earlier. So we heard from them that whilst we've now achieved amongst the best recycling rates in the world, I think we're third in the world for recycling, that took 20 years of planning, of investment, of putting in the recycling infrastructure and the right kind of trucks in place, and then a really strong communications campaign as well to make that level of change. So I think what this says is if we're not thinking about this stuff now, we really need to be cracking on with it and recognizing that this does take time. An example closer to home is the Hywel Dda University Health Board. So Hywel Dda introduced a electric vehicle leasing scheme for their staff. But initially there was a really low uptake. So they quickly realised that there was a need to do some communications campaigns around the offer. So firstly, it was simply promoting the scheme and making staff aware of what was available to them. And secondly, quite an extensive myth-busting campaign. So they did this through newsletters and through their internal intranet. They offered price comparisons showing the difference of leasing and operating an electric vehicle versus a petrol or diesel equivalent. They answered a whole range of FAQs from staff, and they also enabled sharing of testimonials between the early adopters and those who hadn't made up their minds yet about electric vehicles. And what they saw as a result of that was a really big increase in the number of electric vehicles being leased over a 6-month period. It jumped up from 50 to 300 in a fairly short space of time. So really, again, highlighting points we've already been talking about putting the enabling infrastructure in place. So they set up the leasing scheme through a salary sacrifice program, and then doing the communications around it and helping people to make those choices and changes. So that was it from us. The recording of this presentation and the slides will be available on the Wales Climate Week website, and there'll be a Welsh version of these on there as well. So if you have any further inquiries or want to contact us directly about this report, please use the email address there. The Welsh equivalent is ymholiadau@gwasanaetheni.cymru. And we've also now got time for some questions from you all. So Charlotte, my colleague, has been collating those and will be chairing a conversation. So thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr. And over to Charlotte.
Thanks. There has been a question, what role do you see for trade unions in encouraging behaviour change in the public sector workforce?
I can take that, Charlotte. Well, as we've said across the presentation, one of the key recommendations is to follow a collaborative approach, to bring in as many voices, to bring people to the table to hear what are their perspectives, their motivators, their barriers. And we think this is really important to make sure. And also not only want to create a policy, but once you have a plan or a policy in place, create those feedback loops, seek active feedback, because that will help you create a better intervention. I think it's also important to notice that this is very much in line with the 5 ways of working highlighted by Welsh Government itself.
Thanks, Ava. There has also been a question, what are the forums available for sharing the examples of behaviour change for public bodies?
Ava, did you want to talk about some of the research we did on the different channels that we came across of finding how information is shared? It's quite different across different organizations.
Yes. So in the long version of the report, we've kind of mapped out the channels that can be used to disseminate behavioral change case studies. Each organization has different channels. I would encourage people to also bring in green groups, for example. They are quite powerful in the NHS, but also my recommendation would be to use the forums that are available. Like, for example, I suppose the cross-government climate behavior change and engagement group will be one of these forums, but create the governance within the organizations to be able to have that dissemination of learnings. And then apart from that, use the channels that the people in the organization are already using. Like in the case studies, we've seen that they use their intranets and newsletters, etc. Don't know if you have anything to add, Poppy.
Yeah, I'd say that I think this research showed that there's a lot happening already across public sector on behaviour change interventions, but there wasn't a clear go-to place for finding out information and finding out who's doing what across organizations. So that was definitely one of the recommendations, was really making that forum possible. So allocating resource and budgets to that to make sure that somebody is responsible for convening those conversations and sharing information. Because there's a lot out there, but it's a bit hard to find at the moment.
Thank you. We've also had a question. Were there any health boards that had much better outcomes in active travel compared to others? And if so, what kind of features did they use?
So we, when we did the survey, we did send it to all health boards, but I am not exactly sure that if we could see a strong difference. What we know, for example, is Hywel Dda has done a lot of effort in trying to raise up those uptake levels. But I would need to come back to you with more detail on this, and if we can do that post the presentation, if that works.
Yeah, and I think the Hywel Dda case study that we just spoke about, they had one of the standout examples, but that was more around electric vehicles, not around active travel.
Another question. Could you provide any information on the key differences between the different organizations?
I can take that on. I would say across the board, the barriers were quite similar, but they had some slight differences. So, for example, on the NHS, the fact that people work in shifts and they have sometimes not standard working hours really makes it difficult for them to use public transport, because often they would leave the hospital when there's no longer public transport available. Also, it was in the workshops of the NHS that it was raised a couple of times, both from the employees themselves perspective, but also from managers, that if working back so if working from home was coming to an end after the pandemic, with the rising cost of fuels, that they would maybe have to stop working because it wouldn't make economic sense for them to carry on doing so. So real concern about the retention of employees in lower paid grades. And then for the parks, the national park, there were two key differences. One was on the leasing of EV schemes. So all organizations we talked to had these leasing schemes. However, the uptake was much bigger for NHS and local authorities, because basically they're very big organizations that have a lot of negotiation power, and then they have good rates on the leasing scheme. That wasn't the case from for the parks or even the fire and rescue service. And it was the participants themselves who said, yeah, we do have it, but it still doesn't make the EV affordable. So we would actually encourage to try to create a wider public sector leasing scheme so that the small organization can also benefit from this. And then the other difference was for the parks was that when for rangers in particular, that they have a very active job, the idea of then doing active travel was just not on their mind at all.
Brilliant, thank you.
Adding to that, I think obviously the nature of the public sector body and the work that they do has a big impact on their carbon footprint and their therefore the emissions that you're trying to tackle. So yeah, the national parks obviously have a very different approach and land use and to hospitals who will be looking at their procurement of their medicines in particular as to how they're going to reduce their carbon footprint. I think there was a few variations in sort of travel patterns between the organisations as well, and surprisingly was linked to the implementation of home working policies. So as you can imagine, where there were more commonly home working policies in place, there were far fewer people commuting into work or having to drive for work. But obviously some types of work as well, you just can't get around having to drive at the moment, especially social care. That's one of the biggest challenges in Wales at the moment.
Brilliant, thank you. And were there any other suggestions that participants had to adopt alternative forms of transport?
Yes, as I said, the list really is really long. One of the suggestions that participants had, for example, was to actively run a trial in your organization. So kind of giving certain departments or certain groups of people being one at a time, like, please try to come to work in public transport or active travel today and report back your experience so that we can help support it better. And this could help if several public bodies do that. That can really help inform the public sector, public transport networks, cycling networks, etc. And also another thing that came across quite strongly was carpooling. So car sharing, carpooling. So basically having, like, for example, if you think of a hospital, instead of having to park in front of the hospital, having a place with its easy parking and then just having a bus coming back to the hospital. That came across in many workshops. However, from the stakeholder engagement, we learned that those are actually quite difficult to implement. I think the idea in principle is really appealing, but you need to be very careful on how you implement it. For example, taking into account the times that people want to be arriving at work, the times that they want to leave, having the flexibility. How does that combine with other public transport? And how does that combine with them being able to arrive in time for the school pickup and things like that can really affect the uptake. Another recommendation that came across was for certain areas or organizations, resources might be scarce, both in terms of space and in terms of money available to do infrastructure changes. And one of the participants did say, well, maybe what would make sense would be to optimize for one, be it cycling, being it buses, or whichever it is, rather than try to do everything. And because at the moment, the situation is that everything is optimized by car, and unsurprisingly, that's what is the most convenient. So if you are a big city that can afford to try different things, that's very different than if you are a small local authority or a small organization. So I thought that was a quite good point to make sure that you optimize for a desired behavior.
Yeah, I'd say the range of recommendations was pretty huge, from really ambitious, big asks, but good questions like, could there be extensive free public transport across Wales? Good idea. And down to really specific things like providing training for managers on how to support staff to work from home. They felt that there was quite an inconsistent approach to supporting home working, and that could really help both on commuting, but on costs and well-being as well.
And another one that I thought was quite important, that was more on the organization or HR department, is to, like, one of the issues that was raised in all the stakeholder engagement interviews is that feeling that climate change is often the remit of a very certain group of people, and that it's hard to make sure that everyone feels like they have a role to play, and including net zero into performance objectives so that it's not a afterthought, but it's actually something people get tracked or measured, could potentially increase this awareness that this is something that everyone has a role to play. Obviously, this can probably be difficult to implement for commuting itself, but for other behavioral change interventions, that can be a good recommendation to follow.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any further questions? Or Poppy and Ava, do you have any final reflections about the research or the project?
I think my final reflection on the project is, which we've said already, is how there's a strong willingness and interest, and people do wonder what can they do, but often the decision is not down to them to change their behavior, but it's a more wider, holistic challenge. And bringing in this collaboration, making sure that that you listen to voices and activate those feedback loops, and that environment changes before you ask people to do anything through communications. I think it's really important, and it came across very strongly throughout the project. And that's everything from me.
Thanks, Ava. I would agree with that. And I think as well, for me, it was just really important to focus on where the biggest impact is going to be achieved. I think in the past, when you think about behaviour change on energy saving, it used to be things like putting posters up to encourage people to turn off a light or turn off their monitor at the end of the day. I think we need to think much bigger than that and recognise that those small little behaviours, they are important, but to enable structural transformation, you really need to look at the whole way of doing things and that infrastructure and the organizational approach. And I guess the other thing, like I said before, is just understanding that it takes time to change behavior, and that you really need to plan it out, think about how you can measure impact, and provide the resources and monitoring to keep that effort going and see how things proceed over time.
Thank you. There's been a few comments as well that I just read a couple out as we have a few minutes left. There's a free bus in Monmouthshire starting in December. Vic says that's a great idea, and I'm looking forward to trialing the bus. And yeah, I think as part of our research, we did talk to Denbighshire, Monmouthshire, looked at their research because they were quite progressive in what they were achieving. We've also got a comment that's a good point about climate change gatekeepers, and they do need to work harder to engage with the unions about their work. We've had another comment saying the fewer cars on the road, the less road accidents and the less pressure on A&E departments and trauma wards. Yeah, that's very true. It's all these co-benefits that we keep coming back to. We've got some comments about hospitals and GP surgeries with electric car hookups and safe electric car parking and ability charge up would be very well received in rural settings, and generally more cycling infrastructure. There's a lack of cycling infrastructure at GP surgeries. And yeah, I think that's about it. I'll hand back over to Poppy now to finish the session.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Thanks, Ava. I think that does wrap us up for this session.